my three main pieces of advice for accountancy and tax students. Now, I'm talking mainly from a ACCA, ACA, ATT and CTA perspective, but I'm of the understanding that this advice can be applied to university level exams as well, and any exams in general, to be fair. But as I say, I'm talking about accountancy and tax exams from that sort of angle in particular. So my first main piece of advice is past paper practice. Many students, they'll spend a lot of time, or maybe too much time, reading the study manuals, the textbooks, and just simply reading. But the thing about the way our profession is, the accountancy and tax profession, you can't just read and expect to understand. You have to, it's necessary that you apply the knowledge. So that's what I'm saying. Past paper practice as early as possible is my main piece of advice. Leave the reading aside. If you don't have time, if you're running out of time, like some students, the exam will be in 2-3 weeks and they're still reading the material. No, you need to go onto the past papers, attempt them. If you get stuck on the past paper, that's when you go back to the material. It's the other way around. As I say, that's the way the profession is. Accountancy and tax, you have to be applying. You can't just sit there. If you sit there and read, like I've done that before, you're just reading 15 pages, 20 pages. But honestly speaking, let's not kid ourselves. After reading about 3-4 pages, your mind is already sort of steamed up. So it's about applying, and that's what gets the brain going, and that's what helps retain the knowledge. That's what helps retain the knowledge when it comes to your exam. So the first main piece of advice is get onto past paper practice, exam practice as early as possible. It's never too early. Like for example, CTA exams are in May. It's February. I would advise students to start now. You're not losing on anything, rather you're just gaining. You're applying whatever you've learnt onto the exam. So that's the first piece of advice. The second piece of advice is that you must read the question. Now, I'm a bit extreme, and I used to say, I still sometimes say 3 times. You must read the question, as in the scenario that's presented to you, 3 times. I understand with time pressures and just being in the exam environment, that's a bit difficult. So minimum, you have to read the question twice. And the reason for that is, and as I say, like some of this advice might sound simple, but many students don't do it. If you look at examiners' comments for every exam paper, most of the time you'll see something along the lines that students had the knowledge but failed to relate it back to the scenario presented. And that all comes down to this. Reading the question an extra time or an extra 2 times can make all the difference. I can guarantee you that the second time you read the scenario, you'll have picked up so many more things and you'll have a better, broad understanding of the scenario, rather than if you just read it once and you start answering. That's what I used to do that as well. You're under that pressure, you get a bit excited, you read the question, you read the requirement, and you start writing. It doesn't work like that. You have to give yourself the advantage by reading the question an additional time, and that, I promise you, will give you a much better understanding. And honestly, you'll pick up so many more things. You'll be like, okay, I didn't realize that, or that bit at the bottom is connected back to the top paragraph, for example. So the second piece of advice, as I say, is read the question minimum twice. And when I say question, I mean the requirement and the scenario that's presented, and that comes up in the advanced accountancy and taxation exams. The third piece of advice, you could say, relates back to the first advice, which is going to past papers as early as possible. The third piece of advice is, again, this is something that I used to do wrongly, is what many students do is they'll open the question, so they'll open a past paper question, so that's good, but then they will sort of read the question, that's good, and then they'll probably make a few notes, and then they'll start verbally answering the question, go to the mark scheme, go through the mark scheme, say, oh yeah, I would have got that, I would have done that, yep, I would have definitely wrote that. But would have, could have, should have, but didn't. That's what ends up happening. Because if you're just verbally answering the question, it's not really helping you. I have so many students that come to me and they say, for example, I got X percentage, which wasn't enough for the pass. But then they'll say that when I was doing the questions myself, I felt like I was getting the marks. But that's what it comes down to. What you need to do is, let's just say the exam that you're sitting, if for example CTA is 2 minutes per 1 mark. So if it's a 20-mark question, it's compulsory and it's necessary that you give yourself, for 20-mark question, you give yourself 40 minutes, you focus yourself as if you're in exam conditions, you read the question and you actually answer within the 40 minutes. You actually type out your answer. Obviously it's all online now. And this helps in 2 ways. One is you'll be retaining knowledge. In fact, 3 ways. The third is exam technique. So you'd improve on how to actually type up your answer. And number 3 is, we all know that the software is not ideal in this day and age. When you used to write, it used to be like you can just scribble things out, highlight and the rest of it. It's not the same. So you are becoming fluent with the software as well. So that's the 3 main pieces of advice. And number 1 is past paper practice as early and as soon as possible. And honestly, you can even, just by looking at mark schemes, sometimes you can learn. Because the information in the manual will be one thing, but again, accounting and tax, very subjective sometimes. Like for example, advisory papers at CTA. Advisory is very subjective. Two tax advisors may have 2 very different pieces of advice for the same thing. So it just gives you a different sort of understanding or different angle to come at. So past paper practice as early as possible. Read the question minimum twice and 3 times if possible. And number 3 is actually physically answer the question using the time allocated. And hopefully that will be beneficial. This advice has benefited many, and I hope it benefits you too. If you found it beneficial, please leave a comment down below, and I wish you all the best in your studies and your career as well.